Welcome to Module 5 of the Shelter and Settlements training course. This module will look at different issues and key cross-cutting concerns that form the basis for shelter and settlement strategy, as well as how taking them into consideration could help us design a better and more sustainable shelter and settlements intervention. Click Next to continue.
Hello again. This is the fifth and final session of the training video series on humanitarian shelter and settlements assistance. This session will focus on risk reduction and reconceiving the road to recovery. Key points to be discussed during this final session include conducting a review of disaster risk reduction, taking cues from context, recognizing that next steps often means catching up, given the often significant self-recovery activity that occurs after disasters. Linking shelter and settlements, disaster risk reduction, and reconceiving the road to recovery, and the 3 R's, and the implications for future shelter and settlements activities.
The following case study is based on Typhoon Haiyan, Yolanda, that hit the eastern Visayas region of the Philippines. Click the image to know more about this case study. Typhoon Haiyan, locally known as Yolanda, hit the central Philippines with devastating effect on November 8, 2013. It was the largest recorded typhoon to ever make landfall, with the highest landfall wind speeds. It resulted in 6,300 deaths, 23,000 injuries, 1,800 missing, 4.1 million people displaced, 16 million people affected, and 1.1 million houses getting damaged or destroyed. Tacloban is the center of Region 8, Eastern Visayas, the most impoverished and least urbanized region of the country. The largest city in the typhoon-affected region, Tacloban, became a primary hub for the humanitarian response. Many organizations using USAID and OFDA focused on Tacloban for the initial response and follow-on transitional humanitarian activities. A quick check of official 2010 National Statistical Office (NSO) census data indicated that the city had tripled in size since the 1970s to approximately 222,000 people, and there were a total of 45,478 households living in 44,613 occupied dwelling units in the Tacloban. Government damage assessment data for Tacloban indicated that 58,823 dwelling units were damaged or destroyed, about a 50-50 split. What are your first impressions of these assessment numbers? Select the correct option and click Submit. That's correct. From the numbers presented, note that there is a discrepancy of over 14,000 dwellings between existing dwellings from the census and damaged and destroyed dwellings according to the assessment. The government later revised damaged and destroyed dwelling units to 30,262. This correction indicated that 68% of the housing supply was affected in the city as opposed to the original 132%. 1. Estimate the total number of dwelling units in Tacloban at the time of the typhoon, rounding up the 2010 population census total to 225,000 people, assuming all dwelling units in the city were occupied, that is, no vacancies, and assuming one household per dwelling unit. 2. Establish to the extent possible the most accurate representation of the city's damage levels so that adequate resources can be applied in an appropriate manner to respond to identified needs. What further ground truths would be necessary, and how would this be done? 3. Estimate the total number of Tacloban households in possible need of shelter, based in part on the assessment finding that half of the affected dwelling units were damaged and about 40% destroyed. And 4. Identify any shortcomings of a binary level assessment mechanism that only identifies damaged and destroyed dwelling units. 3 weeks into the response, after basic housing market and shelter needs were clarified, the emergency response efforts began to expand and accelerate. There was a rapid embrace of a new national government policy to prohibit rebuilding along the nation's coastline by imposing a no-build zone, NBZ, extending 40 meters, approximately 130 feet, shoreward of the mean high tide line. The NBZ setback had significant implications on current and future response, recovery, and development activities, given that nearly 9 million people were living in no-build coastal zones throughout the country at the time of the typhoon and could be subject to relocation. The NBZ is a perfect storm of sorts based on genuine concern about the welfare of communities devastated by Yolanda and a fear that it could happen again, concerns about climate change and sea level rise severely impacting the country, especially low-lying coastal areas, determination and desire to get it right this time and build back better, assumptions that Philippines would receive significant DRR and climate change funding to reconfigure its coastal areas, and political and economic opportunism. Click the image to learn how the city of Tacloban fared in the aftermath under the NBZ policy. The city of Tacloban also embraced the NBZ policy. Several weeks later, it had adjusted to a no-dwelling zone, NDZ, in recognition that non-residential activities, such as resort hotels and commercial enterprises, might be appropriate shoreline activities. Growing concern and outright opposition to NBZ-NDZ on equity, legal, and economic grounds led to yet another rethink by the authorities. Several weeks later, the NBZ-NDZ policy was dispensed in favor of a science-based effort to identify and map safe and unsafe areas in shoreline areas, even beyond the 40-meter line. Despite these changes in national land use policy, the city of Tacloban appeared from the outset committed to relocating those living in NBZ and NDZ areas prior to the typhoon to a previously identified parcel of land located in a largely undeveloped area of the extreme northern portion of the city. This focus on remote relocation became the centerpiece of a roadmap to recovery plan developed by the city with support from various international agencies. During the many weeks of NBZ, NDZ, and science discussions, affected populations, local and national organizations, local and national government agencies, national and international NGOs, and international and donor agencies all engaged in humanitarian response activities in a generally laudable and expeditious manner. But momentum was slowing. What was next? What would recovery look like, particularly in Tacloban? Click the image to view points to be discussed with your colleagues. Listed below are points to be discussed with your colleagues. Talking points to present to the city of Tacloban to raise concerns about the policy of remote relocation of shoreline area residents, sheltering options to relocation that would serve as a substitute for or a complement to remote relocation. General locations of these sheltering options within Tacloban, while considering the settlement's implications of those locations, and a brief approach to be used to deliver your S&S program over what time frame, linked to what other sectors, and relying on what forms of technical assistance and planning process. First of all, let's go back to basics and remind ourselves that hazards and disasters are not the same. Let's begin by defining a hazard, a disaster, and a risk. Click each tab to view definitions. A hazard is a natural or human-induced process that has the potential to cause loss of life, injury or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. A disaster is an event, natural or human-induced, that causes serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community to cope using its own resources. It is important to understand and recognize that not every hazard can create a disaster. A risk is the probability, likelihood, that a hazard will cause significant negative impact on life, health, safety, property, livelihoods, or the environment. As such, disaster risk reduction, or DRR, can be defined as actions taken to minimize the adverse impacts of hazards. Such actions may be through avoidance, via prevention, or limitation, via mitigation and preparedness. DRR is an integral part of our mandate. It is not an add-on. Why is DRR important to shelter and settlements programs, activities, interventions? Inaction with regard to DRR may well increase the loss of lives, enhance sufferings, and enlarge socioeconomic impacts of disasters. By engaging in disaster risk reductions activities, we can also potentially reduce relief cost in the long run, as was shown in the case study of Kinshasa in the previous module. For every $1 spent investing in DRR in the year 1998, resulted in a saving of at least $46 in 1999. This is quite a significant return on investment, as well as reduction in future risks. More importantly, we need to go the extra step and ask ourselves, what does that mean in terms of impact in the affected community? It means that about 55% of annual household income is not spent cleaning up the house, fixing leaks, replacing your appliances, motorbikes, and sewing machines. It means the family could use the money for food, medicine, education, small businesses, and so on. That is a pretty good payoff, and we ought to do it more often. But how do we do DRR? Click each image to understand how we do DRR. In its most basic and immediate form, we incorporate DRR thinking into relief projects by asking questions such as, how do we minimize negative impacts with our response? How do we promote longer-term view that will not preempt opportunities for reducing risk over time? In fact, about 60% of OFDA-supported projects will have some form of DRR thinking reflected in them, even without direct DRR activities. It is about having long-term considerations with our immediate emergency response. For example, we may ask ourselves whether PVC pipe or bamboo poles should be considered for framing instead of wooden poles, because wood poles means we are going to cut down trees, and that may do more harm to the communities in the long run. By taking DRR a step further, we can also develop DRR projects. This can be standalone, emergency, and country-specific projects such as the mitigation project in Kinshasa. Or it can also be multi-sector, multi-year, multi-country programs in DRR, such as flood mitigation in the Mekong River Delta or the Hurricane Forecasting Program. When do we engage in DRR activities? From what we have discussed so far of DRR, it is clear that getting those mitigation measures and preparedness into place before a disaster would be key in minimizing negative impacts on communities. It is also apparent that DRR is very prominent in the way we plan our responses during a disaster. However, we cannot dispute the fact that communities will most likely be actively engaged in DRR activities after they have recently suffered a loss from a disaster. When the experience is still fresh in their minds, as they strive to move forward in recovery, they want to make sure that the loss is not repeated. Let's take a look at an example from Java in 2006 for how DRR can be incorporated into a transitional shelter program. To put it into perspective, let's first look at some of the statistics of this particular earthquake. Approximately 5,800 people were killed as the result of the earthquake, with 39,000 injured. It was estimated that between 359,000 to 578,000 houses were damaged or destroyed. Even taking the lower damage estimate figures, The damage level is still 30% greater than that of Aceh in the aftermath of the 2004 Asian tsunami. In the most impacted areas, 36% of housings were estimated to have been destroyed or damaged, compared to 34% in Aceh. Java earthquake also caused at least 3 times the number of people displaced when compared to Aceh. Click the handout to learn how DRR can be incorporated into a transitional shelter program. This was a disaster with significant impacts that received relatively little media attention. The program was able to look at ways to promote DRR at every turn of response. Transitional shelter solution provided was a very simple and basic design utilizing local material of bamboo. However, when coupled with a clear messaging on safe bamboo construction, the transitional shelter became a template for DRR learning and training. It is important to understand that the act of adding structural bracing to transitional shelter, as can be seen on the photo, was not the only DRR component that made this shelter safer. What made safer construction practices for the communities as a whole was their understanding of why bracings were needed in the first place. It is likely that transitional shelters will be adapted, rebuilt, and reused, so it is our job to make sure that key DRR messages were absorbed and integrated into the community's practices for sustainable mitigation. The shelter response in Bangladesh for Cyclone Sidr is another example of incorporating DRR components that resulted in great return for money spent during the relief phase. The Transitional Shelter Program decided to base its design on the locally familiar house designs from Grameen Bank. Click the Grameen Bank icon to learn how we designed the Transitional Shelter Program. It's a 2-option housing design for people applying for housing loans from the bank. The program took the design and improved the column specification and its structural bracing system. Within a few months of completing the construction, another cyclone hit the same areas, and the shelters left standing were those built with improved DRR components in our transitional shelter project. The improvements done to the design were not complicated, mostly focusing on basic framing, better columns, deeper columns, better plinth, better bracing, and so on. These are not hard to do, not a large amount of increase in terms of cost, but it takes attention to detail and possibly a reconfiguration of cost. But it has been proven to work time and time again. In many of the case studies we look at, the common characteristics of places include reoccurring hazards and risks. Many settlements are faced with risks of floods and flash floods annually. What we see in this picture is a settlement that is clearly built on and around a natural waterway, an image that is very common in Tajikistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on. Yet through numerous factors, including economical and environmental, these houses are built with mud. With careful maintenance and a strong plinth, some of the houses may survive the seasonal floods. However, these communities will be the first to admit that mud is not the best material to work with when you live in a flood-prone area. Click the image to know why mud is not the best building material in flood-prone areas. This is particularly acute in cases where more intense and prolonged flooding is being experienced, where extended stagnation is breaching any traditional defense mechanism that have been put into place, where landslide is so severe that no matter how strong or safe the shelter is, it will not be able to protect the families and their belongings. In such cases, when we look at the problem on a settlement scale, we may actually recommend various measures aimed at reconfiguring settlements to reduce flood impacts and partial or total relocation as a last resort. Provision of transitional shelter featuring DRR measures, coupled with DRR measures at the settlement level, can reduce losses during subsequent monsoons. Recall the Bangladesh example. It is vital that our interventions consciously strive towards safer settlements as well as safer shelters. Relief and recovery is a dynamic process, not a static one. We need to be aware that our intervention is but one part of a larger dynamic process, and that the process had already started well before we arrived. Most people who have been affected by disasters are not sitting around waiting for us to arrive. So what do we need to do? We need to catch up and take a cue from this dynamic and often multifaceted context. Things are already happening. People are moving in search of a safer place. Some move into host families, while others will start the repairs right away. Sometimes things are not being done very well, and we need to understand that, to understand what our roles could be to improve and add to what is already taking place. Click the GOMA map to understand how we add value by initiating DRR and better S&S practices and processes. Let's look back again at the GOMA case study from 2002. 10 years after the intervention in GOMA, 100% of the households have upgraded to permanent housing. This started as a very modest transitional shelter project, one of the first such projects. It supported 5,000 families, and within 2 to 3 years, around 90% have upgraded their shelters into something more permanent. Support for transitional shelter was crucial for these communities to stay close to their place of origin, which in turn was essential to their livelihood and survival. In communities where businesses are conducted face-to-face, relocations may not be an option for their economical recovery. So knowing that we will most likely arrive after the process of relief and recovery is well underway, we need to think about how we intervene in the underlying processes that exist. A lot of these processes are very incremental, slow, long-term, and with case-by-case solutions. By viewing settlements as the spatial framework for our interventions, it forces us to have a bigger picture viewpoint, a catch-all of context for shelter interventions. By having the bigger picture in mind, we are guided to pay attention to interconnectedness of different components that form a settlement to look for what really matters. This focus on settlement should inform our strategy and program implementation. This area-based approach, or spatial approach, changes the focus from households and shelters to neighborhoods and larger communities. It provides us with a better understanding and ability to project the impacts and repercussions of our interventions. This change of unit of analysis can be particularly useful in urban areas. This approach is seen as shelter-led, though with a multi-sectoral nature and context. This can also have significant implications on the coordination mechanism amongst humanitarian agencies, including the coordination of our interventions with local authorities and national government. The complexities of the context that we are likely to be working in will require that we move from area of responsibilities to area of cooperation with agencies working in collaboration with local authorities as the settlement's multi-sectoral coordinator or its general contractor, assessing and sourcing needs for WASH, health, protection, and so on. One of the key challenges in working with settlements or shelters is, of course, land. With emergency and transitional shelter, uncertainty of land security may be circumvented through designs that can be dismantled, transported, and rebuilt, and through clarification of material and structure ownership to provide shelter security. This is really where land cannot be owned or not under the control of the person who owns the shelter. However, this does not allow for transition into sustainable permanent housing stage for the shelter recipient. If land issues cannot be resolved, nothing will happen at the settlement level. It is important that we understand how land issues can affect our work and try to learn as soon as possible. Delays related to land tenure and land security can grind the recovery process to a stop. Often, informal land agreements and local land tenure systems exist. We should explore how we can take advantage of these informal systems. Click the Port-au-Prince map to understand why multi-sectoral components impact intervention. 30% of previously habitable land in PAP was under rubble after the 2010 earthquake. This fact, coupled with land insecurities and large numbers of renters, the shelter and settlement intervention required a careful planning. It is important that attention is focused on understanding multi-sectoral components required for urban interventions. Some key components could involve land readjustment and reconfiguration of space, making land security more transparent and easier to manage. In order to put our target group on a positive path to permanence, we need to reconfigure the sector's core approach to implementation. Click each tab to understand our approach to the road of recovery. The current practice among many humanitarian actors is emergency shelters, transitional shelters, and a process for permanent housing. Some stakeholders are now promoting the modality of moving from emergency shelter to permanent housing. These are called by different names, but the idea is basically to support building a small part of permanent housing early on. Alternatively, we can provide emergency shelter when there is a need for it, and then support transitional shelter that facilitates the process toward permanent housing, as we have seen in some examples previously discussed. Within this alternative approach, we may need to support provision of permanent housing on a very limited basis for the more vulnerable spectrum of the communities, such as the elderly, people with disabilities, orphans, or child-headed households. At the same time, we should understand that we cannot provide permanent housing at a large scale. There is a comparative advantage in facilitating the transformation of transitional shelters to permanence. This takes into account the fact that in most recent post-disaster situations, there were no large-scale providers of permanent housing. For a neighborhood approach to succeed, support for settlements-focused activities is critical. At the micro level, or community and settlement level, this is where most local humanitarian organizations will feel most at home. This is where their work happens, where the projects are implemented. At the macro level, the notion of looking at the big picture to support human habitat will generally fall into the realm of international development organizations, such as the creation of built environment professionals diaspora that provided technical assistance to those working at the micro level in Haiti response. This technical support resulted in neighborhood-based projects, which are now the basis for replication by many development agencies. Beyond the implementation of two-story transitional shelter mentioned earlier, the neighborhood approach effort in Haiti was something that will likely have a lasting impact, as well as in neighborhoods that will replicate this process. In this project, 20% of the site was reconfigured through a settlements planning process. The reconfiguration meant the expanding or reconfiguring existing pathways. New retaining walls were introduced with DRR considerations. New drainage was provided, and other activities to make safer shelters and a safer settlement. Through reconfiguration, more land became available by using land more efficiently. Click the image to view benefits of the neighborhood approach effort. The process also changed the market for land and housing, making pre-earthquake vacant land more valuable. There was some land in and around the neighborhood that wasn't being used, or wasn't being used anywhere near its development potential. The project improved the neighborhood and added value to those lands, completely changing the market for land and housing in a long-term development context. So don't look for more shelters in the future. Look for more housing. That's very important because more housing supply is needed and may be spontaneously and privately provided. It may not be the result of programmed interventions of international agencies, but because the affected families want to invest in housing opportunities. Suddenly, their land is more valuable, and they see an opportunity to develop rental housing, which is very much needed in the wake of an earthquake. We have so far confined our discussions to within the humanitarian arena, within the shelter and settlement sector. We have talked of avoiding resorting to tents and camps as default responses, thinking about livelihood generations, thinking about DRR, and integration of other sector activities such as WASH. However, conditions in the settlements are extremely complex and vulnerabilities are rapidly increasing. We hear about climate change and sea level rise, urbanization, clustering along coastlines, 1 billion people at risk of sea level rise in cities, low-lying coastal areas being inundated, and so on. Development policy itself almost seems like a mega hazard in the universe of risk reduction, particularly when we mainstream DRR development policy, which is great and necessary, but not sufficient. Click the image to view the long-term impact of humanitarian assistance intervention. What we really need is our humanitarian assistance intervention, which can have long-term impact, promote the process of transitioning into permanent housing, and how it facilitates this transition from relief to reconstruction or relief to development. It is going to require some new alliances. We need to talk to new audiences among ourselves, among the developed communities, and across various local and national organizations. In this long-term process, as we think about new audiences, we also need to think about new tasks and new outlets. This online training is a part of the effort to reach out to wider audiences, to utilize the internet space to further our access and capacities, and to create common understandings amongst the widely diverse potential collaborators. We need to advocate for more people to engage in the process through knowledge generation and dissemination because there are common objectives for humanitarian assistance and development assistance communities. For example, both sectors would like to keep people out of harm's way, but if we only focus on the humanitarian sector, it is easy to overlook the challenges as they relate to the development sector and focus on hazards and figuring out ways to reduce or prevent occupancy of areas with high risks. But then the development sector is looking at the trend for explosive increase in urban population, at tripling land requirement when the population doubles. Then we need to ask ourselves, how do we sustainably keep people out of harm's way? This is not easy to achieve. This means that we need to be able to prevent encroachment and re-encroachment and reoccupation of those areas that have been cleared. This has been done successfully with urban gardening, for example, or urban forestry, trying to figure out ways to preempt occupation. We also need to be responding to those affected by disasters and crisis with new and cost-effective methods. This is something that we will all need to continue to work on all together.
Key points to remember from Session 5 include: to move ahead, sometimes you need to catch up to self-recovery efforts. Along lines noted with shelter, settlements do not really provide shelter unless they are linked to risk reduction. Shelter is the easy part. The tough issues are on the settlement side of the sector. And reconceiving the road to recovery entails a reconception of basic processes and some retooling by humanitarian and development actors. You survived. Congratulations. On behalf of USAID, OFDA, and Interaction, thank you again for taking the time to view these 5 training modules. We sincerely hope that you will be able to apply what you have learned when responding to future disasters. If you have any questions or comments whatsoever, please feel free to contact me, Chuck Setchell, at csetchell@usaid.gov. Thank you again for your time.